Welcome to the presentation of the paper Exploring the Evolution of Software Practices. The article reports empirical research between the IT University of Copenhagen and industry. The research came about when meeting the CTO at a meetup on continuous software development. The company is developing administrative software as a service. The team integrates both the development and evolution of the software and the operations. So additionally, the team is it's distributed and partially dispersed. So part of the team works from Kiev, Ukraine, besides the people in Copenhagen, and additional team members are working from home or third countries. When we looked at how they develop software, that was not resembling any of the methods that we knew from research or from teaching. On the other hand, it's not chaotic, and there's not much ad hoc development. People know what they're doing and why they're doing it. An example of what we observed is visible here in the picture. You see here two developers in a stand-up meeting. Stand-up meeting takes place every day. It's short. However, it is not standing up. It is everybody sits in front of his or her workstation, is connected on a Slack channel, and the meeting is moderated by a slide deck, Google slide deck. So when we then looked into and started to see how can we understand what we see here, how can we conceptualize conceptualize what we see here, we started to ask ourselves, like, how can we actually investigate a development practice like that? So, and how can we describe that what we see is not just random ad hoc behavior? So this led us to the research questions here. Research question 1, how can the evolution of software development practices be investigated, and what distinguishes a software process that has degenerated from one that has evolved as a result of conscious deliberation? Answering the latter would also be relevant when discussing Scrum, BAT, or hybrid software development processes. How should we relate to that? Should we relate to that as methodological innovation, or should we relate to that as people not knowing what they are doing? In order to research that, software engineering literature discusses practices and the relation between methods and practices, but not very much in depth. So we therefore went to social theory. Our interest is in how the software team evolves its way of developing software. So we looked for social theory that allows us to talk about practices as a core concept. Social practice theory invites itself to that. It's a group of a family of theories that sees social interaction as a fundament or constituent of social structure. So it looks into how social structures evolve from practices. And we can see here the stand-up meeting, or a normal stand-up meeting, not the one that we just discussed, as an example. So people meet regularly at a certain time. They are standing up when they are during that time, and they're talking in a specific way. The activity of how they are working how they are doing this is actually what the constituents, or what the rules that apply in this context, or the structure that a stand-up meeting provides, is constituted by the way it is enacted in everyday practice. So within social practices, we looked into Shatsky Schatzky has developed the notion of social practices by developing Wittgenstein's or basing it on Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. So Schatzky defines social practices as doings and sayings that are linked by common goals and purposes, explicit rules and instructions, and a shared understanding of how different means are used for the common goals. And we can see that again very, very well in our stand-up meeting. So we have the purpose here, that is the coordination of work and the knowledge sharing. We have explicit rules standing up, and there's a time limit of it. And we have a common understanding, for example, of what kind of concerns to raise. So if a developer would actually start to talk about architectural concerns or things like that, probably somebody would invite him to schedule a meeting. And he would not be offended by that. So he would say, yes, yes, this is beyond what should be at a stand-up meeting. We did our empirical research was again focused on what kind of practices what was our research focus, and that was practices. So we chose empirical fieldwork because it allows us to understand the rationalities of practices. So we worked with observation, especially of the stand-up meetings and the retrospectives, but we complemented that with informal and semi-structured interviews, both to understand the background of this evolution of what was our case then, the stand-up meetings, the evolution of the stand-up meeting, but also getting a perspective on our evolving understanding of the ingredients that made this possible in this company. The analysis is twofold. There's a detailed interaction analysis of relevant part of one of the retrospectives, and a thematic analysis of the observations and the interviews. In order to increase the trustworthiness of the research, we worked with triangulation. We triangulated over, we had different kinds of data. There were altogether 4 researchers involved. We checked with the participants in the study whether our findings resemble their understanding of what was going on. And we did a conscientious audit trail, and you can see the detailed descriptions in the paper. So now we come to, you will be curious about what we actually saw, and you will see in the paper a much more fine-grained analysis of the retrospective. So as I said, we focused on the evolution, or kind of an evolution of the stand-up meeting format. And that started actually before the retrospective. So that started with a developer from Kiev being not happy with the knowledge sharing at the stand-up meetings. So he raised it in a meeting with the CTO, and they decided this might be something to discuss with the whole group. So then in the beginning of the stand-up meeting, he raised that by stating, our stand-up meeting is getting shorter and shorter. We are not sharing a lot from different teams anymore. So what's going on, kind of like, yeah. The team decided to discuss that, and they discussed in a quite meandering way, but we can actually identify the characteristics that Schatzky puts forward, or proposes to identify practices. So the team, for example, discussed the purpose of the stand-ups, both in the beginning as a motivation for taking that up and discussing it further, but also at some point developers were saying, like, okay, another developer was saying, well, okay, what are we talking about to be the purpose of the stand-up meeting? We are, it's not only knowledge sharing, it's also coordinating the day's work. they were together investigating into the what actually changed in the common around the stand-up meeting that rendered this kind of shared understanding of what to raise and what not to raise and how much to talk about the stand-up meeting, that rendered that not valid anymore. So they discussed that one of the causes they identified was that they started to work in smaller teams, and they had individual stand-up in the smaller teams, and that caused them to not work in the not discuss so much in the shared stand-up. Then finally they came about to discuss the rules, and they decided to change the rules so that it is not the individual developer that actually tells or shares knowledge, but it is a representative of each of the sub-teams. They opened up for individual sharing and communication as well, but the main part was the sharing from the sub-teams. So with other words, we can see Schatzki's characteristics of social practice showing in the retrospective. The changes in the rules were then implemented as an experiment, and it was taken up in the next retrospective 3 weeks later, and then they decided to, for the time being, to keep that format. So, but what else enabled these kind of practices? And here we have the retrospectives has been complemented with a number of other practices or attitudes that underpinned as a common understanding the whole development in the company. So we have a clear pragmatic stance, and that was visible whenever we talked with the developers about how they develop software and what they were doing. So we just do what works and what makes sense. And everything, so that was very clearly that was an argument to cut off things that they didn't like to work with. So one example that I can, other than the stand-up meeting, is, for example, they earlier had a mandatory code review of each piece of code that was checked in. The developers then said, well, we actually know what we are doing. We know when we need a code review. So why don't you make it voluntary? So we can ask each other when we think kind of it's good somebody else has a look at that piece of code. So and that was granted. The other part is, the second theme here is experimentation. And experimentation, we saw that with the stand-up, that in the first retrospective, the team decided that to change the stand-up meeting format. However, when we saw the next retrospective, it was very clear that it was not a decision, oh, this is how we do it from now on. It was an experimentation. So they tried it out until the next retrospective, and then they discussed it again and decided whether to keep or not to keep it. And only then it was a fixed part of the common practices. So trust and responsibility is kind of what is the basis of the whole. Both the company trusts the developers to know what they are doing and to do a good job and to be engaged in doing a good job. And on the other hand, on the other side, this is combined with a high responsibility of the team. So we see, for example, that the developer in the Ukraine did not only say like, okay, we are not sharing as much as we used to do, who cares? He was taking this up both with the CTO and then also in the retrospective. The high reflection and awareness of how are we working, how does that affect our kind of way of developing, as our quality of the software, our happiness, our usage of time. You can see that very much in the retrospective as well. But that is not only a coincidental that happened to be that way. It's actually an attitude that the CTO is fostering very, very consciously. And especially he reports on using the one-on-ones as a way of coaching the developers into this kind of reflecting on their own processes. Now we come back to our research questions. How can the evolution of software development practices be investigated? Social practice theory provides a conceptual frame to understand the evolution of practices. And the frame allows to identify and describe meta practices. That means practices of changing practices. And so it allows both the seeing the established way of working, but also seeing how the established way of changing the established way of working. So to research question 2, what distinguishes a software process that has degenerated from one that has evolved as a result of conscious deliberation? If we can identify these meta practices, they are an indicator for the conscious deliberation and change. And what we see here or observed in the company can be seen as an agile way of software process improvement. So what can a company take away from this research? Software practices need to be established and carefully evolved. When introducing new methods and evolving software practices, we can learn from social theory. And especially, we should take into account the purpose and the goals that a method or a tool or a technique is trying to address, the explicit rules and guidelines that it provides, but also what is the implicit and shared understandings that it is built on. And we have to fit that into the context of the team and the context of the specific development process and challenge. So, with other words, the social theory actually provides tools and concepts to inform and further develop this practice of changing practices. Thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye.